Yep. So from here to here, there's something in here that I'm not being allowed to show. Let's see if it does it again. Yep. Oh, here we go. Here we go. Alright. Yeah. Let's see if it does it again.
To make this stuff, they had to take two plants that don't grow anywhere near each other. And like there's like 1 million plants in the Amazon, so like how do you figure that out? Nobody knows. And then you have to cook them in this very particular way for a particular amount of time before you produce this stuff. So one of the plants has DMT in it, which is a very intense psychedelic, but it's very short acting. And the other has a MAO inhibitor. So if you take the DMT and you take the MAO inhibitor, then the DMT trip lasts for much longer. And so that's what these Amazonian natives figured out. And no one has any idea how they managed it. And if you ask them, they tell you that the plants told them how to do it, which isn't much of an explanation as far as modern people are concerned. But then when modern people take the ayahuasca and the plant, so to speak, starts to talk to them, they're a little less leery of the whole theory that the plants had something to do with this. So, you know, and these things, I'm loath to talk about this because I'm not an advocate for drug use. But by the same token, you can't ignore empirical data. It's not reasonable. And the empirical data that psychedelic substances can produce mystical experiences and that those often have a transformative effect. I mean, one of the latest studies showed that if you took people who were dying of cancer and you gave them psilocybin in a sufficient dose to produce a mystical experience, that you radically decreased their fear of death. It's like, you got to think about that, man. That's tough. That's a tough experiment. You just wouldn't expect that. You think, you take someone, you derange them intensely, and then when they come back, they're not, even though they're dying, they're not nearly as afraid of dying. You know, you got to kind of wake up and smell the roses when you see something like that. And the people who are doing this research are very reliable people. So there's the Amanita muscaria. You know, there's this old idea, it's quite a funny idea, toadstools. So flies like Amanita muscaria. And there's some, this is ridiculous, there's some evidence that they actually like getting stoned. So, because animals will eat these, like reindeer will eat these things too, and they get pretty tripped out by them. And so I have this book on psychedelic use among animals, which is a small book, but, and so, so there's this idea that toads used to sit around the Amanita muscaria and wait for the stone flies to like buzz badly around them and then snap them up. So that's pretty funny, I think. And so, and you know, there are mushrooms in the US that are the oldest organisms on the planet. There's one mushroom, I can't remember where it is, but it covers something like, oh God, I don't know, like hundreds of square miles. It's like this huge thing, because it's all underground, right? And they have these very complex networks of mycelia, they're called. And they think the thing is like 150,000 years old, something like that. So there's plenty of things about the world that we don't know, that's for sure. There's the chemical makeup of the classic psychedelics. You see, they all have the same fundamental structure. This is serotonin. That's one of the major brain neurotransmitters. And so what happens with the psychedelics is that they alter the brain function by altering the neurochemical utilization of serotonin. They change the manner in which the serotonergic systems work. And the serotonin system is a very basic system, because when you're an embryo, and your brain is developing, it's the serotonin projections that basically orchestrate the development of your brain. So they're very archaic circuits, very, very archaic circuits. So, and this is the paper, I think I stole this from psilocybin Griffiths, who's been doing a lot of this research. Psilocybin can occasion mystical type experiences having substantial and sustained personal meaning and spiritual significance. So, why? That's a good question, right? So here's a question for you. It is beyond dispute that human beings are capable of religious experience. Why? Why is that exactly? And you can associate it with psychosis, but that doesn't work. Because the theory doesn't hold water. It's not the same thing. So why is it there exactly? And it's not an easy thing to figure out. Like I'm always trying to figure out a biological explanation for everything, right? Because if you want to find something to stand on, you want to make sure that it can resist a challenge. And so if I can find an explanation for something that's reductionistic and materialistic and biological, then I'm going for that. But that's a tough one. Consciousness is a tough one. The moral sense is a tough one. They're not easy things to crack. The Big Bang is a tough one. So, you know, I mean, a cynic might say that maybe sometimes when people are close to suicide, they'll have a mystical experience, you know. And maybe you say, well, it's a last-ditch attempt of your brain to delude you into thinking that your life has some significance, you know. And that's a plausible theory, but I don't think it accounts for the generality of the phenomena. So I don't buy it. What happens in the shamanic experience is that the shaman has the experience of being reduced to a skeleton first. So a death experience, a very realistic death experience. And then the next thing that happens is that he finds himself in a place where he's communing with the ancestral spirits. And then after that, there's the climbing of something like the ladder, Jacob's ladder, say, and an encounter with God for all intents and purposes. And it's very widespread phenomena. It's the world tree, and I've thought about this a lot, trying to figure out what this represents. According to a Yakut informant that's in Siberia, the spirits carry the future shaman to hell and shut him in a house for 3 years. Here he undergoes his initiation. The spirits cut off his head, which they set off to one side, for the novice must watch his own dismemberment with his own eyes, dissolution to the primary elements in some sense, and hack his body to bits, which are later distributed among the spirits of various sicknesses. It's only on this condition that the future shaman will obtain the power of healing. His bones are then covered with new flesh, and in some case he is also given new blood. So there's a death and resurrection experience that's associated with the shamanic ritual. We're here in the presence of a very ancient religious idea which belongs to the hunter culture. Bone symbolizes the final root of animal life, the mold from which the flesh continually rises. It is from the bone that men and animals are reborn for a time. They maintain themselves in an existence of the flesh, then they die, and their life is reduced to the essence concentrated in the skeleton, from which they will be born again. That's a good graphic representation of the experience. That's an old painting by, I think it's Hieronymus Bosch, if I remember correctly. I really like that because it's reminiscent of the near-death experiences that you hear people describe, and they're quite common as well. And I had a very weird experience once. I don't think I've told you this story. I was assessing depressed for so long, and you know, he'd sort of healed up and everything. But if your left hemisphere is damaged, especially the frontal part of your left hemisphere, then you can be in a chronic state of depression, because the left hemisphere, generally speaking, is responsible for positive emotion. And so if it isn't there, then it's like negative emotion for you. And so I went and assessed him, and I was giving him this, I think it was called the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which is a kind of a standard half personality test, half psychopathology test. And he was filling it out. He was a very serious guy, middle-aged guy. Nothing about him was new agey in the least. He was like an accountant. I think in fact he was an accountant, if I remember correctly. And there was one question, and it said, "My spirit has left my body." I think that's right. It's very close. And he stopped and he asked me, well, he said, "I'm not sure how to answer this." And so I said, "Well, why?" And he said, "Well, after I went through the car windshield, I was in a coma for 3 weeks, something like that, and I died." I think he said he died 3 times. And he said that he could remember. He couldn't remember anything during that period of time, and he couldn't remember the car accident. That's retrograde amnesia. It's quite common with head injuries. And he said that during one of those experiences, and this is all he remembered from the hospital, was that he came out of his body and went down the long tunnel of light. You've heard these near-death experiences, and then saw his family members there and saw the heavenly light, and then realized that it wasn't his time and came back to his body. Now, what was interesting about this guy was that, well, first of all, I didn't ask him about this, right? He basically volunteered the story, and it was instigated by this question, and he didn't know that anybody else had ever had an experience like that, because I asked him if he'd ever heard anything about like that, and he said no. So that was interesting. But what really was interesting is, how the hell did he remember that? Right? Because he had amnesia during that entire period of time. He was in a bloody coma. It's like he didn't remember anything. He remembered that. And so, well, those experiences are more common than you think. And then there's a painting of one, which is quite interesting. And that's like a tunnel to heaven. It's the same basic idea. It's a little bit more suffering going on in this one, I think. But that's pretty much typical of Hieronymus Bosch. I mean, I don't know what was up with that guy, but he was one strange character. Now, the Scandinavians have this idea that the world is a tree. And I've been thinking about that a lot. I think that the tree idea, the tree is something that is grounded in matter, let's say, and that reaches up to heaven. In the Scandinavian tree at the bottom, there's quite a cool idea at the bottom of that. See, this tree is constantly being gnawed by snakes. You can sort of see the snakes at the bottom. And at the same time, it's being watered, and the water makes the tree grow at the same rate that the snakes gnaw at its roots. So it's like a yin-yang idea, that there's continual chaotic destruction and replacement at the basis of whatever this process is. But the tree seems to me to be a representation, not so much of, it's like a different dimensional space. That's what's trying to be represented. So imagine that, you're structured. If you take powers of 10 magnification, say human beings are about in the middle of the tiniest thing and the largest thing, if you do it by powers of 10. And so, you have a subatomic level and an atomic level and a molecular level, and, then maybe a level of organs, and then there's you, and then there's your family, and so on, all the way up the tree, fundamentally. And so I think that what this tree represents, and this is the thing that the shaman moves up and down, I think that's what it represents. It's this different view of its dimensionality. It's something like that. And I think that what happens in the psychedelic experience is that consciousness can travel up and down that structure. It's something like that. And maybe not only up and down it, but maybe right through it. Now, I know that's a radical claim. It's a really radical claim. And it might be wrong, but it's probably wrong even, because most radical claims are wrong. But I'm not so sure it's wrong. And here's something cool. So that's the Scandinavian world tree, and that was drawn by an anthropologist who visited the tribes in the Amazon who use ayahuasca. Now, you see, it's a tree with snakes. Well, that's reminiscent of the story in Adam and Eve, obviously, but it's also reminiscent of our primate dwelling place, right? Because that was basically our ancestral home. A tree surrounded by snakes, and the snakes like to eat us. And this is a long time ago. This is like 50 billion years ago. It's really a long time ago. And so we don't know where these images come from precisely. But I do have the suspicion that we used the circuitry that we developed to detect snakes to represent the unknown as such, because like a snake is something that comes out of the unknown, and like we evolved, right? We all evolved out of an animal substructure, and so we had to get our biological cognitive structure from somewhere, and we have this capacity of thinking about the absolute unknown and the terrors that are involved in that, the horrors that can emerge from what we don't understand, and it stands perfectly to reason that we would use circuits that were already pre-developed for that, and that this is a reasonable representation of the existential structure of the world. So, and I think I might have showed you this before, but it never ceases to amaze me, this picture. So, my son drew this when he was 8, and so on the right you see mushroom houses, and they have the names of all his friends on them, and so that's order, right? And then on the left side you see chaos there, and that little orange thing is a bug. And then there's a river that runs right down the middle, and so that's like you know, the yin yang symbol with the divide in the middle. So that's quite cool. And then there it is. There's Jacob's ladder. It's like Jack and the Beanstalk, which is, by the way, another variant of the same shamanic story. And there are bugs going up and down it. And they're taking messages from heaven. And then up there in heaven, it's got the sun, and there's St. Peter. And I don't know where in the world he got this. It's not like he had a lot of religious education. I mean, despite me. And you know, there's the pearly gates up there, and then that was the world as far as his. He had a very well-ordered psyche, I would say, and still does. But when he drew that, it just absolutely blew me away. And so I had it laminated, and it's in my office because, well, I don't know, because like, what the hell do you make of that? You know, that's why. So. Well, you sort of get the picture there. You know, the cathedrals, the great cathedrals of Europe they're like the forest in stone, right? And they try to represent the light coming through the leaves. And so it's sort of our ancestral forest home, but it's transformed into these great sculptures of stone. And, you know, they produce awe because of the combination of light and darkness and color. But also, I think for the same reason that huge trees produce awe in people, you know, and we don't want them cut down. They seem sacred in some sense, and perhaps they are. But, you know, it also seemed to me, this is an intuition, that the architects of these great cathedrals were trying to express something that's deep and structural. They're trying to express the idea that if being was constituted properly, then it would be organized from the subatomic level all the way up to the highest cosmic level perfectly, so every layer stacked on top of each other without any contradictions, and that would be an ideal mode of being, and everything would come together under those circumstances. And that's what's being expressed in these cathedrals. It's not all that's being expressed, because they're also shaped like a cross. And you know, the idea is that the center of the cross, which is the center of suffering, is also the place of the individual, the place where the transformation takes place. That's all built into the architecture as well. And so, then there's the tree-like structures that make us up. It's stretched down to the